welcome to the Indomitable Podcast. I'm your host, Di Cerullo, and today we have another great episode that will leave you inspired. My guest today is the indomitable Lee Wind. Lee Wind's superpower is stories, true and fictional, that center marginalized kids and teens and celebrate their power to change the world. He's a prolific author, podcaster, blogger, and an amazing queer community elder. His books released for just 2024 include A Different Kind of Brave, The Gender Binary is a Lie, and the forthcoming Love of the Half-Eaten Peach dropping this September. Well, hello, Lee. I am so grateful to have you here today.
Hi, Di. I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Yes, I'm so excited. Okay, so before we go off onto a tangent here, I wonder if you would share a little bit about yourself for the audience that is not maybe less aware of you than I am.
Sure. I'll start out by saying I'm gay, and that's always a fun way to introduce myself because I spent 14 years hiding that I was gay. I kind of knew pretty clearly at age 11, but also knew that it wasn't really safe to share with either my family. I'm first generation American. My parents immigrated from Israel, so they kind of like brought a lot of the homophobia of that culture over with them. Also, Philadelphia suburbs at the time that I was growing up were not exactly a safe space. So I didn't come out completely to everybody in my life until I was 25. So those 14 years of being closeted were really formative and really changed how I see the world. You know, I laugh that my most recent novel is sort of like a spy novel, this action adventure thing. And I laugh that, well, I've never been a spy, but I was undercover for 14 years. And I think that the thing I've really learned is that being gay, being the G of LGBTQIA2+ community,
right.
I really figured out on the journey that my goal is to be an ally to everybody else in that queer community, but also beyond that to women and to people of color and to disabled people and indigenous people and really to everybody that isn't getting the opportunity to succeed and to be their authentic selves. So I aspire to be the best ally I can be. And that influences a lot of what I do. I joke that my books are sort of like if I had a time machine and I could send them back to myself when I was 11 or when I was 15, like they would have changed my life. And so that's sort of that's my compass, right? Okay. Like, and I find myself sort of surprised because there's a real range in the stuff I write, but all of it is the kind of thing that like, wow, if I could just like stick it, even if the time machine was the size of a microwave oven, just send it back.
Just the words, right? Just the book.
Like,
absolutely.
Oh my gosh, what's this? I have this metaphor. Anne Lamott wrote a great book about writing called Bird by Bird. Mm-hmm. And in it, she talks about how lighthouses don't run all over an island looking for boats to save. They just stand there and they shine. And I love that so much. And I kind of feel like, especially in this moment where books with any queer content for kids and teens are really under fire and attack, I just feel like I'm not writing it for the haters. I'm writing it for the people that it's really going to give them hope and get them to see some representation of themselves, both in history and in fiction. I feel like that's the thing I try to hold on to. I'm not trying to convince the world that I'm right and they're wrong. I'm just being like, look at this incredibly cool stuff that I found out. Yes. And let me shine a light on it. And if you want to come to the light, great. And if you don't, that is okay too. I don't control you.
Yes. I have never heard that quote before. And I'm sure you watch just as it's like hitting me. And I'm just like, oh, I have been thinking about this in just a way that is getting me more burned out, right? I mean, I mentioned to you before, I have kids. I'm constantly trying to keep them in a bubble of safety as much as I can so that they can be as safe as they can be so that they can be whoever they want to be. I'm watching these things happen around us and I'm just like, trying to take the hits and trying to just keep them on the road to who they're meant to be rather than the same thing. I mean, I'm a millennial. Like, we have most of our generation been throwing off the sort of the belief systems and the baggage of the previous generations, and you're constantly under fire in that way, right? I constantly feel like if it's not one thing, if it's not, we can't be a queer community. We've got to pretend there are no, gay teenagers. It's heartbreaking for me as a parent to still see that we are in this place after the community has fought so hard. There has just been such a huge, pendulum swing back. As a writer, how do you focus your heart so that you aren't bearing the weight of that emotionally?
I think I try to focus on the fact that I'm not writing it for the haters.
Of
I'm
course.
not, No Way They Were Gay is the first of my nonfiction books for kids. Basically readers 11 and up, and it highlights men who love men, women who love women, people who love without regard to gender, and then people who lived outside the gender binary. Yes. And that book has ended up on a number, like a handful, like maybe 5 challenged lists.
No.
But what's interesting is I recently was moderating a panel, and we had George M. Johnson, whose book All Boys Aren't Blue, which is a memoir for teens, is the number 2 most banned book in the country. It was challenged last year, I believe, 82 times. So I was curious. I was like, I know the effect on me, 5 times, but 82 times.
Right.
And it was really interesting because it's like at some point you just have to sort of like focus on, well, what are you trying to do? Yeah. Right? Like, what is your hope? Once the book is out in the world, we don't control how it's received, but there is that moment when it's ours, right? Like it starts out, I've shared this with you, but it starts out like when I write a book, it's mine. And then like it gets sold to a publisher, and then it becomes sort of ours. Then there's a whole team of people that make it as good as it can be. Right. And then it goes into a reader's hands. And at that moment, it's no longer mine or ours. It's theirs. It's theirs. And they get to kind of like bring themselves to it and get out of it what they want. I think that it's interesting, especially with the nonfiction books. There's this sense that like books for kids are seen as sort of prescriptive. First of all, history is always presented in this sort of like medicine kind of way. At least it was to me when I was growing up. I never really had a history teacher that was like, let me see a reflection of myself in history. I mean, I present white, although, being Jewish isn't really white when you talk with a lot of crazy people. But like, there's a lot of privilege that I've experienced presenting as a guy, identifying as cis, and, going through my life looking the way I look. And at the same time, there are things that I was not clocked about. Like, it wasn't necessarily clocked being gay. It wasn't necessarily I was clocked being Jewish. So there were a lot of moments where it was like my acceptance or my privilege was conditional on me hiding who I was, which I think really influenced me in everything I've done. Because when I started the whole thing with history started because I went to a lot of gay people who are, or queer people who are closeted. When they finally come out, it's almost like they have to be teenagers again. Yes. So I came out at 25, but then it was like, oh my gosh, I never got to do all the things that my teenage friends did because I was in a big acting moment, right? I was being fakely. So I actually went to like a weekend camp for gay men. Mm-hmm. And it was like, it was like circle in the woods and you hold hands and you tell stories and there were little like, sessions that were talks about like, learn how to make pottery and learn how to, make those little keychains that, you weave. And like, it was basically like summer camp for gay adults. And there one person gave a talk and he was talking about letters that Abraham Lincoln wrote this other guy, Joshua Fry Speed, that convinced him that Abraham was in love with Joshua. And I was just sitting there and I was like, that cannot be true. I mean, like I had a pretty good education. I went to a good public school. I got an undergraduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania. I have a master's from Harvard in education. Like I got a pretty good education. And I had never heard this. No, and I'm like, what are you talking about? So I couldn't get it out of my mind. So I went to the library and I got out a book. And I really hated history. I thought it was the most boring subject ever. But I got out this book from the library that it was called Joshua Fry Speed, Abraham Lincoln's most intimate friend. I'm like, okay, what? It's a very skinny book. The first half of it is like, it's just history. It's just somebody talking about history. And I was like, yeah.
Yeah.
But the whole second half of it are the letters. And I was like, okay, let me read the letters. And like I said, wasn't much of a student for history. So I was just flipping through the pages. And sidebar. So when I was closeted, I dated girls. And in high school, in college, in grad school. And I say I kind of make a face because I'm embarrassed. Like I look back and I'm like, oh, it was so inauthentic and it was so unfair to those women. But I was just struggling to do my best.
Yeah.
And I kept hoping the feeling would come, right? Like I
Right.
knew what all the songs said about the love stories. And I was
Right.
like, well, maybe it's just I haven't dated the right woman. Right? Like it just hasn't clicked in yet.
Right.
So I am like, lackadaisically going through the appendix of this book. And I land on a letter. And this is a letter Abraham Lincoln wrote to Joshua Fry Speed. And in it, he says, you have now been the husband to this wonderful woman for 8 months. Are you now in feeling as well as judgment glad that you are married as you are? I was like, wait, that's me. That he's talking.
Yes.
That's exactly how I felt. I judged it. It was the safe thing to do for society,
Right.
what my parents wanted, what everybody wanted me to do. But I didn't have the feeling. And then Lincoln goes on and says, from anybody but me, this would be an impudent question not to be tolerated, but I know you'll tolerate it. From me, please tell me quickly. I feel very impatient to know. You look at the timeline of what was going on, and it was less than 6 weeks later that Abraham married Mary Todd. And I was like, it was just like, wow, there was like, there was some evidence, some primary source evidence that maybe Lincoln was a guy who loved another guy. So I got really into it and I started to read all the letters and I really dug into the whole Lincoln thing. And there's all this stuff like Lincoln and Joshua lived together for 4 years and they shared a bed, which was evidently very typical at that time on the frontier, but it wasn't, Springfield wasn't really the frontier, but what they did in bed is less interesting to me than did they love each other.
Right.
So they lived together for 4 years. And then Joshua tells Abraham he's moving back to Kentucky and he's leaving Abraham. So historians, quote unquote, look at Lincoln's life, and Lincoln had these major periods of depression in his life. And there was one in particular that was like the worst depression of his entire life. And all the historians are like, yeah, don't know. There's really no reason for it, that we have no idea why. But for some reason, the first week of January of this year, he was really abjectly depressed. And it took him months and months and months to recover. Well, that was the exact same week that Joshua told him that he was leaving him and moving to Kentucky to marry this woman named Fanny. Like, it does not take a rocket scientist to connect these two things, right? So I got really excited. So I thought, well, this could be a really cool novel, like about a kid today that discovers this secret about history that Abraham Lincoln was in love with another guy, because I am completely convinced. And so I wrote this page turner novel, and it's called Queer as a $5 Bill. And I actually crowdfunded it back in 2018. So this is that one for people watching the video. And it's about a kid that, is closeted and discovers this stuff about Abraham Lincoln. And he lives in a very small town called Lincolnville, Oregon. His parents owned the Lincoln Slept Here bed and breakfast. And he basically decides he's going to out Abraham Lincoln because he's assigned the same book report, the same book. He has the same epiphany moment that I did, right? He's inadvertently dating his best friend because it keeps him safe from the bullies, this girl, Mackenzie, but he can't tell her, he can't tell anybody his truth. And then he decides he's going to out Abraham Lincoln. It goes viral. It becomes this big media firestorm and conservative backlash, as I think it would. And then he has to kind of decide. They bring in a civil rights attorney to help them because they're going to lose the family business. And she has an openly gay son. She's black and the son is black as well. And so there's a lot of stuff about like Lincoln was kind of racist and we don't really talk about that in history. And so I was able to get into a lot of really cool things, but basically the main character, Wyatt, has to decide, because no one's going to believe a gay kid saying that Lincoln was gay. So is he going to stay closeted and try to change the world, or is he going to like follow his heart because he's kind of has sparks flying with this other young gay teen? So that was Queer as a $5 Bill. But when I was writing it, there was just so much evidence about Abraham and Joshua. And I just started putting it aside. Like there's a big section at the end because all the quotes in the book are true, all the historical quotes, and I have them all at the end in endnotes. But I just started collecting all the evidence. And I was like, well, do I want to write a book about a historical book about Abraham and Joshua? I was like, no, that actually sounds boring even to me. Yeah. So I was like, well, that's probably not the book I want to write. But I started to collect all these stories about other men, like Gandhi is a great example. Like the love of Gandhi's life was not his wife, Kasturba. It was this guy. It was this German Jewish architect whose name was Hermann Kallenbach. And there are 200 letters back and forth between them that are published online. And it is astonishing. Gandhi was trained as a lawyer in England, and there's actually a love contract between him and Kallenbach where they pledge love and more love, such love as the world has never seen to each other. It's unbelievable. So I started to collect all these stories, and I was like, well, maybe this is what I'm interested in doing as a history book. Maybe the idea is that, look, we teach history in America still as this facade. We say that the only important people that did anything in history are straight, white, able-bodied, neurotypical men who were rich from Europe, and that's kind of it. And and maybe some American men too, right? But they had to be descended from white men in Europe. Like it's just such BS. And I thought that like tearing down that false facade in this one way, because for me, that was it. Like it was the beginning of tearing it down was the story of Abraham and Joshua. But then it was like, there was Gandhi, and then there was Bayard Rustin, who was this openly gay civil rights leader who was kind of sidelined because he was gay, but he was the one that taught Martin Luther King Jr. about nonviolent protest. He was the one that organized the March on Washington, where Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech. It's just like there were more and more and more incredible stories. And then there were the stories of women who loved women, like Eleanor Roosevelt and Queen Anne. And then there were the stories of people who kind of like lived outside these boundaries of gender, Christine Jorgensen and Wewa. There's over 150 native nations in what is now called the U.S. had people that identified outside of what we consider the gender binary, and they were respected, and they were part of those communities. And with colonization, there was this concerted effort made to sort of like destroy not just the people that lived those roles, but the roles themselves. And so I wanted to like, it wasn't that I wanted to write an encyclopedia. It's almost like I wanted to do like tapas, like here's all this cool stuff, and get a taste. And then there's crazy extensive endnotes. The book has been out for more than 3 years. No Way They Were Gay. And what I'm super proud about is that, yeah, it's landed on a bunch of, challenge lists, but nobody has ever been able to point to anything in the book and say that's not true, because it is airtight. It was
your receipts.
Yes, exactly. I brought my receipts.
In the back.
And I worked with, so the publisher of the nonfiction books is Lerner, and they are really, really well respected with libraries and schools. And so that's really helped too. And actually both books got a Junior Library Guild selection, which is like a big honor.
Congratulations, that's awesome.
Thank you. I just found out for the new one. So coming out in August is The Gender Binary is a Big Lie. And I have a cover of an ARC here. So I was excited about that. And that one goes more into the idea of like, well, where did this idea of a gender binary come from? Like, we think it's so rigid, right? It's completely made up. And like gender is...
It's not even like, that's not even realistic for children.
Oh gosh. And then actually you even look at those stereotypes and you go back 100 years, just like 105 years. And pink was actually the color for boys, because like, and there's actually a great quote from like a children's clothing catalog that explains that, like, blue is daintier and more appropriate for girls, while pink is a decidedly stronger color and more appropriate for boys. Like, and it's not that like the categories of men and women don't exist. It's just that this idea that everybody is supposed to fit into these two boxes, and then we gender everything. I mean, like, do you really need to gender soap?
Toys, like, clothes, everything.
Everything. It's everywhere. It's so prevalent. So I wanted to get into like, where does this come from? And then also show that there are around the world and across time, there are cultures that have seen gender differently and more expansively than we do. Like a great example is in Southern Sulawesi, the Bugis people, they have actually 5 genders. They have like, men, women, they have people who have male bodies who have a feminine gender identity. They have people with female bodies who have a male gender identity. And then they have bisu, who are sort of seen as spirit mediums, and they encompass all genders and no genders. It's just this other category that is very vast. And the other thing that's super interesting to me that I was so surprised about was that so we think that there's only 2 kinds of bodies, and oftentimes on forums you'll see, male, female, but and we confuse bodies and gender all the time in our culture. But actually 1.7% of people are born intersex, and which is actually the exact same proportion of the population that has red hair. Interestingly enough, I think a lot of people know other people with red hair. I think maybe less people know somebody who is intersex. And there's a lot of shame that is being pushed onto people who are intersex. They're not a single, they're not a monolith. There are many, many different variations. There's an argument that like, well, it's nature. Actually, if you look at nature, nature is incredibly diverse.
Nature is queer. Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah, and there's so much, and there are all these metaphors for gender that I find fascinating. There's a spectrum, there's like stars in the sky, there's the idea of a wheel, there's an idea of a gender unicorn, which is really, really cute from Trans Student Educational Resources. So I go into a lot of that kind of stuff too, but also looking at colonization and how this idea of the gender binary was really imposed, and it was very similar to race, the idea of race. It was a construction to decide who has power and who doesn't have power.
That's right.
So, and a lot of it's tied into misogyny too, in terms of like, who's allowed. I mean, look at voting rights. Women weren't allowed to vote. Originally, it was white land-owning men were the only people who were allowed to vote in the US. Like that's, and there were these major struggles for expanding suffrage and, voting rights. So I get really into it because I kind of feel like what ends up happening is that when you start to see more history, it's an invitation for other communities to start diving into their history too, and diving in beyond it. Like we were talking, I was thinking about like, I want to see a neurodivergent history for kids, right? Like who were the neurodivergent people in history, and like, what did they do and how did it impact us? Because I don't know, I certainly didn't learn it in school, but I want to be there as an ally, and I want to know. Something that blew my mind, Sappho, is I think people, some people might know the name Sappho because sapphic is sort of like means sort of lesbianish. So the word
lesbian, taken that over too. Yes. Queer community.
So the word
that. Yep.
Yeah, it actually comes from the island that Sappho lived on, which was Lesbos. And so Sappho was really famous. So for people that don't know about her, she was kind of like I don't know, Lady Gaga and Madonna and like all the pop stars that you can think of, because really poets back then didn't write their poetry down and get it published, right? Like this was like thousands of years ago. They basically performed their poetry. Like it was like deaf poetry jam, right? Like they had like an instrument and they would like accompany themselves and they would perform. She was Western world famous at that time. And she was famous for 2 things. One, that her poetry was incredibly beautiful. And the other was that her poetry was mainly about her love for other women.
Yes.
We have one poem that has, and then because of her being so openly in talking about loving other women in her poetry, there was a lot of efforts to systematically destroy all of the copies of her work that were written down. So what we think was maybe, like 11 huge volumes of her work at like the famous library in Alexandria in Egypt, like very little of it has survived. I think like, a tenth of it or maybe less. So there is one poem we have that's almost complete. And in it, she talks about how all the epic poets at that time, what they were famous, they were all guys. And what they were famous for, what they praised was pretty much expressions of toxic masculinity. They were like, the most beautiful thing on the earth is armies charging off to war, or, cavalry on the attack, or a fleet of warships. Like, that is what they elevated. Sappho wrote this poem, and she's like, no, it's not any of those things. The most beautiful thing on the dark earth is the face of the woman I love, flashing radiant, more important to me than all of those chariots and infantry in full display of arms.
Yes.
There was something about that just resonated with people at that time. Because I think if you go and you stop anybody on the street today and you say, what's the most powerful thing in the universe? They're probably going to say love, like love. The power of love, yes. True love, right? All those Disney movies that ends with a kiss of true love. Yes. It all comes back to Sappho talking about how much she loved Anactoria. Mm-hmm. So, and so like 800 years ago when they, in France, they were writing, the Sleeping Beauty, the kiss that woke Sleeping Beauty from the curse was the kiss of true love. That is a direct lineage from Sappho's poem and, her love for Anactoria. And that is mind blowing, because I think that we all know about the kiss of true love's power, but we don't know that it actually comes to us because of this woman loved another woman. She loved a bunch of other women too. Give her props. But I think that that's amazing. So history starts to make sense, right? Like, you look at Gandhi and him being the one that had this sort of like huge breakthrough in humanity. Like, look, it doesn't matter if you're praying facing left and I'm praying facing right. We're all praying to the same God. That was a giant moment. I think it can't be coincidental that he was the guy that said that and he was in love with the German Jewish guy. That seems connected to me.
Yeah, and also the fact that when he was in jail and his wife got sick first, he let her die rather than, placate the British. And then when it was his turn to be sick, then it was time. Then he was a little bit more invested. And I always wondered about that until you say that to me. I was like, well, that story makes a little bit more sense if he was actually in love with someone else, right? Queer history puts such an gives context to history, right? I'm not asking you to agree with that part of history. I'm just that makes
and I don't know that part.
Yes. I mean, I think about that all the time. I think about when we are, that's because of ADHD, all of these and I love history. So all of the facts I've ever learned about a person are always interconnected in little webs in my brain. So you say Gandhi to me and you're like, oh, this. I'm like, my God, of course. At first I was like, how can both of these two things exist alongside each other? One, that he's creating these amazing forms of protest and nonviolence, but then also this little fact about his wife. I'm like, ow.
It's interesting.
Sorry, I interrupt.
Don't apologize. I love it. No, it's a conversation. I love it that it's a conversation, and I love learning new things. So I actually discovered something that was really interesting, because when I was learning about Bayard Rustin and reading about Bayard Rustin and how he actually went to India to learn about the Gandhian tactics, but Gandhi had already wasn't there, right? And so I then was. So there's this idea that the great man theory of history, right? That going back to that idea that only men did the important stuff. And
according to other men.
Yeah, exactly. And then I stumbled on the biography of, hold on, I'm trying to look it up in the book, Gloria Steinem. In her autobiography, she talks about, she visited India in the late 70s because she wanted to kind of collect Gandhian tactics into a pamphlet for women's movements everywhere. But when she went there and she interviewed a woman leader who had fought in the fight with Gandhi in that sort of protest, she discovered that actually the things that Gandhi became famous for, all the nonviolent protests, were actually strategies that women had been using against the movement against sati, which was basically they would, if your husband died, they would burn the widow on the funeral pyre. And the women's suffrage fight in England for, women's fighting for their rights. Gandhi gets the credit, for
Mm-hmm.
it, and maybe he took it to a new level, but he didn't come up with it. He
It
just
wasn't.
took
Yes.
the things that women were doing, but
Yes.
we don't talk about that. So, and it was so interesting that I only found that out from reading Gloria Steinem's autobiography, and I
Right.
was like, oh, I'm so glad I found this, because otherwise all the credit goes to the guys, and
To the
that's
guy.
just not
Yeah.
that's not cool.
I love that. So as you're talking, I'm sitting here like, so in community, in queer community, anytime that there's like a person in history, for example, like a writer, and she's talking about her love for another woman, and they find the letters, and historians are like, they were roommates, right? Like it's so prevalent throughout our history of our shared history, that queer history has to be just like tamped down and ignored and all of those things, that as queer community, one of the jokes that we tell each other is they were roommates, right? Like anytime somebody needs to come in and quote the Bible, one of the things that I love to do if I'm feeling particularly sassy online, if somebody's going to quote the Bible at me, I'm always like, ask me about King James's lover, like I'm always, you know what I mean? Like, so it's so funny to me, the superiority that we have to march around with, or at least that queer community have to put up with, even though we know better, even though we have to carry within ourselves our own histories, right? Because they won't be told if we don't remember them. And I think that
Yeah,
that's fascinating.
and this sort of like double standard, like if they were straight, then it's really
Yes.
important to talk about the fact that they were
Yes.
married and they had
Yes.
kids. But if they were in love with another, if they were in love with if it was a woman in love with another woman, that's like, well, no, they were
They were
just
roommates.
friends. They
They
were
were
roommates,
friends.
right? Right. Even though we have letters like Eleanor Roosevelt's letters with Lorena Hickok, it was like, the thing I miss most is that, the feeling of the northeast corner of my mouth against your lips. Like,
Right? I can't even
this was,
remember who it was. You're going to know it better. But like, there's this quote from a writer where she's like, I ripped open the letter and licked the envelope to get a taste of your, and they were like, and historians are like, they were roommates. And we're all like, why do you care? Like, why do you care so much that you would hide this from us? Like,
right. Well, I think it's
I mean, I
empathy
know
part of
why,
it.
but like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, and that's it. Also, circling back to the idea of like, banning books.
Yes.
It's not just the books that end up on the list. It's this whole chilling effect, trying to like, keep books away from kids. And it's interesting because they're not trying to keep cell phones. They're not trying to keep smartphones out of the hands of kids, right?
Yes.
So it's
Yes.
like they've given up on pretending that we don't exist. What they're now pretending is that, like, what they're now trying to say is that we are not worthy of empathy, because I think that that's what books do really well. Like,
that's right.
Books let you kind of identify, and I think that actually is one of the reasons I do both nonfiction and fiction, because it's like with fiction you kind of like you care about these characters in a way that, because you're kind of like inside their minds and you can kind of like identify with them, and it becomes actually in a way really important to see ourselves in fiction. And because that's where empathy grows. I think I really feel like books are empathy machines. I didn't come up with that. Somebody else said it. I don't know who, but it's brilliant. And it really is. It's like you care, and then you can see whether it's a reflection of you or if it's a window into somebody else's life, or a sliding glass door, as the famous quote goes, giving you access to understand somebody else and to have empathy with them. I think that's why the attack is on books, because they can't say that we don't exist today, but they're saying, oh, well, we're brand new. Gender diversity, they're saying it's brand new. No. It's totally not. There's a whole chapter in No Way They Were Gay about the Pharaoh Hatshepsut, who, thousands of years ago, basically had a public transition of their gender from the daughter of the king to the and widow of the king to being co-king herself, and then senior co-king, and you can see statues of Hatshepsut changing the physical form, going from like really feminine to sort of like an in-between state to really, really masculine, like squared off shoulders and pecs and like a false beard. It is fascinating. And then also with the Egyptologists, Dr. Karakuni, she has a great book about it called The Women Who Would Be King. she was talking about how like in Egyptian art, there were two colors for how they portrayed women were portrayed yellow, because that was like the indoors, the sun didn't touch them. So they were sort of like more like pristine yellow. And then men were portrayed red in this sort of dark russet, because they were outdoors and, again, sort of toxic masculinity, manly. And then, and that for Hatshepsut, in the middle period there, her sculptures were orange, which didn't exist previously in the art history of Egypt. So like that was super fascinating too. I get like crazy into it.
Oh my God, I love history, and I especially love queer history. So, I mean, carry on. I've got time.
No, I did want to say though that the thing about empathy, and that kind of leads to why I write my fiction books, because I really feel like that's a place where we're not seen enough. Again, going back to that time machine in the microwave, if I could send, if I just came out, just in March, A Different Kind of Brave came out. And this is like my gay teen love letter to James Bond movies. And I'm so excited by it because I love action movies, and yet they're super, super problematic. So I really wanted to kind of like pull it apart and like get into it and be like, well, what if I had like two teenagers, and, one is living a life of adventure and the other has this life of privilege, but the kid who is living the life of privilege really like idolizes James Bond and wants to be just like James Bond. And then, and so that's the story I wrote about how the Nico is like escapes from this gay reprogramming center in the beginning. That's the opening chapter of the book. Not much of a spoiler. And then he's on the run for most of the book. And then Sam is sort of like the guy that wants to be just like James Bond. But he feels way too much and he is too emotional. And so they end up meeting in the middle of the book and then kind of falling in love. And then they have to save each other and also go back and try to save the other kids who are trapped in the institute. So it becomes this like action adventure kind of like, homage to and also deconstruction of everything that's problematic about the James Bond movies. But like, I'm super into the gadgets and the chase scenes and the explosions. Like I'm into it. I love all that stuff. And yet at the same time, like James Bond is a pretty horrible role model, right? Like he uses sex as a manipulative tool, like to get what he wants. He's really inauthentic. Like there's this whole, he uses violence to solve every problem. Like
there's stuff.
There is a lot to unpack there. Yeah. So it's really fun to kind of like, go into it and kind of create this cast of characters that what I hope is that it's going to be a series and that we'll get to see more adventures and, see them have to save the world again. Because it's like a love story and it's an action adventure romance. And I think that we like love stories so much because we know they're going to end well, right? Like, and that lets us invest emotionally in that empathy and in that character and kind of trust that like, okay, I'm not going to be crushed emotionally. The world is hard enough, right? Like, I think that's why romance is so popular because it's like, okay, I can invest my heart in these characters because I know it's going to end up okay for them.
Especially time period romances, right? Like time period romances are escapism now because you know that everybody's going to live, right? And if they're not going to live, at least the whole planet's going to live. And that's kind of different from like futurism where you're kind of like not sure what happens, right? I think that's fascinating. So you're using nonfiction to set the record straight, and you're using fiction to rewrite the things that you love, including yourself. And I think that's awesome. That's really cool.
Thanks. And it was interesting because the world is so on fire right now. I mean, that's what everybody, the media is constantly telling us. The world is on fire. The world is on fire.
The world is on fire.
So writing, A Different Kind of Brave was really hard because I kept beating myself up. Like, I should be working on something important. Why am I doing this? Why am I wasting my time on something so frivolous as like a fun beach read, right? Like I was so mean to myself. But what I discovered in the process of working on it was that like centering two gay teens and, surrounded by a really queer group of friends,
right?
Like that feels revolutionary, making them the heroes, making them have to save the day or save the world, or at least part of it. Like that actually getting to see ourselves in that position does feel important. And like I had to kind of like allow myself to believe that
Yeah.
and to kind of feel it. And it's really exciting because now it's starting to get out in the world and people are reading
Yeah.
it. And I that's again, it goes from mine, ours to theirs to
Yeah.
yours.
Yes.
So that's
And
been really fun.
you're building community. Like you're taking stories, letting people see themselves in stories, and not even just see themselves in stories, see themselves in history. How can anything be more important than the ability to see yourself and know that you're valid, especially in the world that we live in today, where the outer world is just like, oh, lesbians are different than gays and bisexuals don't belong and trans people don't belong under the queer umbrella. And I just knowing our history in that way, knowing how it was lesbians who were, saving gay men during the AIDS crisis, like the fact that they want to rewrite our history to tear us apart from each other. What more could you be doing as a writer than keeping the record straight, so to speak, right? Like, I mean, I would encourage you, just writer to writer, friend to friend here, absolutely give yourself more credit. Like you are letting people see themselves in history and in the world, and that absolutely matters, right?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I remember feeling so alone. It's like I was the
Yes.
only person that ever felt this way in the history of the world. On the one hand, we want everybody to feel unique, that you are a
Yes.
unique snowflake, right? Like,
Yes.
but on the
Yes.
other hand, we're like, if you fall outside the two boxes, right? The sort of like, hetero cisgender
Yes.
box of
Yes.
men and women, male and
Yes.
female, then
Yes.
oh my gosh, no, you're an aberration. You've never existed before. Wait a minute, no, that you have this
Historically, yes.
legacy, and
Yes.
you are not alone. And I feel like you are not alone in, and you can still be unique is like
It
this
gets better.
lovely
Yes.
contradictory thing, but like it's
Mhm.
really important for all of us who are sort of identify within a group that isn't, um, you know, the
The
rich
main
white
narrative.
oligarchs
Right.
in charge,
Right.
right? Like we need to kind of recognize that, like, not only are we not alone, but we are stronger together. Like there's a beautiful quote, really one of my heroes from history is Bayard Rustin that I mentioned earlier.
Mm.
And he has this
Yeah.
beautiful quote from 1986 where he was talking about, someone said, what other advice do you have for other Black gay activists? And he wrote, the most important thing I have to say is that they should try to build coalitions of people for the elimination of all injustice. Because if we
Yes.
want to do away with the injustice to gays, it will not be done because we get rid of the injustice to gays. It will be done because we are forwarding the effort for the elimination of injustice to all. And we will win
Yes.
the rights for gays or Blacks or Hispanics or women within the context of whether we are fighting for all.
Right.
Like, yeah, that I mean, he said it so many
Yes.
years ago, but like, yes,
Yes.
100%. That is what we are dealing with now. And so when people are saying like, oh, that book about Black history doesn't belong, yes, it does, and we
Yes,
have to
it
fight
does.
just as hard for that because
Yes.
it's this systematic kind of thing where they're attacking us, they're attacking
Yep.
trans people. That is our fight
Mhm.
too, even if
That
we're
is our
not
fight.
trans, because
That's
if
right.
they take away trans rights, guess who? They're coming for women.
Yep.
They're already taking away
Already
women's
here.
rights to the
Yep.
autonomy of their bodies. Like it
Yes.
is all connected, and it is all this sort
Absolutely.
of gasp of patriarchal
Oh, yes.
privilege trying to like claw their way. And this affects
Yeah.
voting rights.
Trying
This
to
affects,
claw their way back. Yeah.
yeah, because they know they can see the numbers, right? Like they're no
Right. What do they
longer.
call that? An extinction burst, maybe? Like, yeah, an extinction burst. It's when like the last gasp of something is trying to hold on. So it seems like it's all worse for a little while until as something is dying off, right? Like as a system of oppression is dying off, extinction burst.
Oh, I
See,
love that.
history. I love history. I think we can all be special snowflakes, right? We can all be special snowflakes, individual snowflakes within a tapestry of a winterscape, right? We are all in this painting together. I'm so appreciative of the work that you're doing so that our community can see themselves and know that they belong here fighting alongside us. So proud of
Thanks.
you.
I'm grateful that I'm not on that journey alone. That's what's really
Right?
cool.
I think that that's building community is going to be the thing that moves the needle, right? Like as long as we are individuals, we can be silenced, we can be changed, the history of our individual lives can be rewritten to fit the main narrative. But if we are all in this together, if we are all fighting for our history together, then that's not going to happen. And I think that that's important. So I love the work that you do.
Thank you.
I'm so proud of you. As I am always saying, I would love this conversation to go on for literally forever, and I would have you on every other week if you were writing books every other week. I want people to be able to follow you and support your work and read all your books. How do people best do that?
So, sure. So my website has all the links to it. So it's my name, Lee Wind,
Yes.
.org. So that is the hub to see everything and to get me on Instagram and
it's
YouTube.
It's a beautiful
and
website
Facebook.
too. I mean, I was checking it out. I was like, God, it's so pretty.
Thank you. I worked hard to make it nice, and had some help.
Thank you so much for being here. I am so grateful for your work, as I said. Y'all, thank you for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the Indomitable Podcast for more incredible stories of humaning. Remember, my new book, An Indomitable, A Foster Care Story, is available wherever you get your books. Thank you to all of my Indomitable friends who have come out in person and online to support me in sharing my experiences. It means the world to me, especially during Foster Care Awareness Month. If you have any upcoming events you'd like me to bring the Indomitable experience to, please submit a request via my website. And finally, as ever, I am so happy that you're in community with me. And remember, together we are truly indomitable. Have such a great week, everybody. Take care.